Thank you very much for attending the first lecture of 75th anniversary lecture, come the 36th Qianmu lecture in History and Culture of New Asia College. Today's lecture is jointly organized by the Institute of Chinese Study, CUHK, and New Asia College. We are extremely honored to have invited Professor Alan Chen Gam Leung, JSD Professor of Chinese Culture, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, to give us a talk on Confucian harmony and the ethical transformation of complexity. We are also very delighted to have Professor Lau Chi Tim, Executive Associate Director of Institute of Chinese Study, CUHK, to be the moderator of this lecture. So without further delay, I will now pass over to Professor Lau to introduce the speaker and start the lecture today. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, Professor Alan Chen, Professor Chen Zhenghan, distinguished guests, and colleagues and all participants. It's my great honor and privilege to welcome you all to the first lecture of the 75th anniversary lecture series, come the 36th distinguished Qianmu lectureship in History and Culture. 香港中文大學新亞書院75週年校慶學術講座暨36屆錢賓四先生學術文化講座 co-organized by the New Asia College and the Institute of Chinese Studies of CUHK. Today we are gathered here to delve into the profound wisdom of Confucian philosophy. And it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our esteemed speaker, Professor Alan Chen,陈金樑教授. Professor Chen is the JSD Professor of Chinese Culture at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, 香港中文大學李榮森中國文化講座教授. Professor Chen has had a distinguished academic career since he completed his PhD at the University of Toronto. Professor Chen has held several prominent positions in various prestigious Asian universities, including Professor and Associate Provost at the National University of Singapore, where he received the Teaching Excellence Award twice. From 2009 to 2019, he served as Dean of the College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences and Vice President at Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. As well known, he most recently served as Provost of CUHK from 2020 to 2024. Professor Chen and I have known each other since our early careers and share common interests in Taoist philosophy and Taoist religions. We collaborate on the publication project of studying the Taoist canon of the Qing dynasty. Professor Chen's research mainly focuses on medieval Chinese intellectual history and hermeneutics of classical Chinese texts. He has published widely in these areas. Among them are He Xianggong's and Wang Bi's commentaries on Lao Tzu, philosophy of the Tao Te Ching, and also analysis in early medieval China. Today, Professor Chen's lecture, Confucian Harmony and the Ethical Transformation of Complexities, will enlighten us with an exploration of the essential concept of harmony, He, in Confucian culture. The idea of harmony is deeply embedded in Chinese thought and is often understood from the perspectives of cosmic, social, and familial harmony. Also, He can be drawn from the art of cooking, where different ingredients are mixed to create a balanced and faithful dish. And I trust certainly different senses of harmony or occur are sometimes conflated or treated as a single interpretations. But still, it can also yield different meanings of the ideal of harmony in Chinese culture. In this lecture, Professor Chen will illustrate the question of harmony as a contextual concept in early China and reflect on Confucian harmony as a guiding vision and an active agent in the management and ethical transformation of socio-political complexities. The discussion will undoubtedly provide valuable insight into how Confucian thought can enrich our deeper understanding of harmony and its value in addressing the challenges and uncertainties of our world today. As we gather here today, let us take this opportunity to reflect on the rich meanings of harmony in our lives and our society. So please join me to welcome Professor Alan Chen to the stage without further ado. Thank you. Thank
you very much, Ji-Tim, for your very kind introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It is really wonderful to see so many friends in the audience. And I should also welcome those joining us on Zoom as well. I am deeply honored to have the opportunity to present the 36th Qianmu lecture. And please also let me congratulate Xinya Shuyan New Asia College on its 75th anniversary. Now, the topic I have chosen for this lecture concerns the central Confucian concept of harmony, 和. Come to think of it, this concept really pervades Chinese culture. In various contexts, in our daily interactions with people, in how we manage human relationships, the concept of 和 really is everywhere. And at least since 2004, this has also become an important topic on the national agenda. The notion of a harmonious society has become formally, officially recognized by the central government since 2004. I need to switch it on.
Yeah, switch it on.
I forgot about that.
What is it?
Yeah. But as Ji-Tim has already mentioned, at least in early China, the concept of harmony, 和, was very much subject to different interpretations and therefore can be described as a contested concept, shaped by different metaphors, especially these two. One that is shaped by the metaphor of music, and the other, as Ji-Tim has also alluded to earlier, by the blending of different ingredients in cooking. What I really want to do, and in fact, I have studied this concept for quite some time, and in an earlier study, I have tried to explore these two different conceptions of harmony, focusing especially on their internal logic. But later, as I will suggest, I think I didn't do a very good job in that earlier study. So I take this opportunity also to revisit this topic and propose certain suggestions for your consideration as well. Methodologically, I generally looked at the development of Chinese philosophy as a history of interpretation, which is to say, when you look at the flow of intellectual history, diachronically, if you like, it is shaped by the hermeneutical process, interpreting key concepts in different ways. Certain key concepts, such as Tian or heaven, Dao or De, may have emerged as central threads in the development of Chinese thought, but they are subject to interpretation. And while certain interpretations may have emerged as dominant, that does not stop the continuous development of thinking. That does not stop the interpretive process. And I think today we also need to reflect on the ongoing development of Confucian philosophy as it must engage with new realities and new challenges. One point that I will emphasize later in this talk is that interpretation is never straightforward. In the Confucian case, the interpretation of harmony is always also shaped by our understanding of other key concepts. So how we understand Ren or Li, for example, would impact on our interpretation of filial piety, of harmony, and other concepts as well. So that's the background. Let me very briefly take us through the two main interpretations of He harmony. I must apologize, my PowerPoint skills are rather limited. Now, in the sense of musical harmony or harmony of sounds, that actually appeared very early in the Chinese literature. Verbally, He can also be pronounced as He, and it connotes responding to certain sounds in an agreeable way, in a friendly, sympathetic way. And there are alternative pronunciation of the word as well, which I will come back to later in this discussion. And the last, Hu, somehow has come to be associated with the game of Mahjong. An early example of the usage of the understanding of this concept in terms of harmony of sounds appeared in the I Ching. I think you are familiar, most of you will be familiar with this particular line, 鸣鹤在阴，其子鹤之. It's a metaphor of a crane calling out to its offsprings and getting a sympathetic, concordant response. Now, come to think of it for a moment. That is not necessary. Responses to a call could be hostile. If the sound that is coming to us is unfriendly, the response need not be harmonious. But in this particular context, shaped by a particular view of the parent-child relationship, the line could only be understood as a friendly response. And we will have to try to explore why that is the case. We can cite many, many other such examples. Here in the 论语, for example, we find Confucius reportedly would join in harmony, in accompaniment, when he came upon a performance of fine singing. I won't read the Chinese. My favorite text, the Lao Tzu, also has made use of this concept of harmony. And in this particular chapter, interpreting it from the perspective of sound or music. But later I will come back to the Lao Tzu, which may suggest a different understanding of harmony there. So two different types of sound harmonizing with each other. There's actually a lot of debate in the literature on the precise meaning of yin and sheng. What do you think they mean, actually? Some scholars might suggest one is a single voice and the other is instrument. But regardless, here quite clearly the concept of he is understood from the perspective of music. And you see the earliest official definition, if you like, of this word, he, in the Han Dynasty lexicon, the 说文解字, simply as responding to one another. 相应. From sound to music, quite evidently, involves only a small semantic step. And a further extension of meaning would see the concept of harmony being extended to the socio-political stage. Again, just some very well-known examples here from the 左传. Here you see peace among rival states is likened to musical harmony. In the Xi Jing, in the book of poetry, the very, very first poem in that collection describes the ospreys calling out one another, and the assumption could only be that the response is harmonious, which is to say, is another variation on the general theme of idealized, sympathetic, or affectionate response. And this particular poem is interesting because it has been interpreted later during the Han Dynasty when the poems were collected and explained, and the so-called Great Preface explained it explicitly in a socio-political context. The music of a well-governed era is always peaceful and joyful, and its government and politics is he. Now, in traditional tonal music, what actually does harmony mean? It suggests that the different instruments, if you're thinking of an orchestra or voices coming together in concert towards the performance, the realization of a preconceived goal, a score, a tune, and every part plays an equally important role, but distinct roles. They are all led by, guided by certain lead notes or an overall score. For those of you who play music, in the traditional understanding of harmony, a chord would require several notes, but always one root note. Now, when Confucius sang in harmony, he was recognizing the superior performance of the masterful singer and submitting to its beauty authority to a superior quality. And from that perspective, you can well understand why the concept of harmony, understood from the perspective of music, is usually associated with certain other concepts, such as yielding to a superior authority, 让, or 顺, conveying a sense of compliance, yielding to a higher purpose or direction. Although I also note that Confucius actually asked for the song to be performed again before he joined in harmony. So presumably that kind of recognition of superior performance or quality is based on discernment. Some of you may know that I will begin also a lecture on the concept of 孝, on filial piety later. 孝, actually, come to think of it, was associated with respect quite a bit in, let's say, in the 论语. 孝 and 敬, these two words appeared together quite often in the early literature. But today, we don't usually say 孝敬 to translate the sense of filial love or care. We would usually say 孝顺. So how does 顺 come to be associated with 孝? That too is an interesting topic to explore. Now, let's turn to the other main conception of harmony in early Chinese thought, in the world of cooking. I've just chosen one example to give you a sense of how the concept of 和 could be understood apart from music. I probably have gotten the translation wrong, but the general sense is clear. 和, harmony, is like a thick, substantial soup with meat. Ingredients, of course, you have water, you need fire. The next two words, 西海, in Cantonese, I think it's pronounced, Jiwa can correct me, Hei hoi, basically would refer to some kind of sauce made of meat. But most importantly, salt, plum, vinegar, that is, to cook, the meat and the fish, tending to the fire. But importantly, what is needed is that the ingredients must be blended carefully together. So 和 in that sense, 和 in that sense, so as to create a balanced taste and puts in what is lacking as the text continues, so as to discharge, get rid of, balance out what is in excess. Now, comparing a little bit the two different metaphors of harmony now. As a culinary metaphor, you have blending of different flavors into a balanced whole, merging into a unified taste. I'm sure you can think of your favorite examples. When I was in Singapore, when I was in Korea, I would usually suggest, think about ginseng chicken soup. Can you distinguish the taste between the ginseng and the chicken? The ginger and chicken can also come together to make a wonderful, delicious dish. And if it is cooked well, The ginger will have seeped into the chicken, as it were, infusing it with flavor. Now switch back to a musical performance. Musical harmony, you have Ipa there and you have Erwu also. They, of course, can perform harmoniously, but you can still distinguish the two sounds. Erhu is Erhu, Ipa is Pipa. The violin is there, the piano is there. They work well together, but one cannot usually say they merge into one sound. So to me, that suggests a very different understanding of what harmony means and how does it work. I think when you talk about cooking, you don't usually think of salt yielding to the vinegar. There is no rang, there is no shen. But in a musical conception of harmony, then these related concepts would make much better sense. Now, when applied to especially to the ethical and socio-political arenas, I think these two conceptions of harmony carry very different implications. I think, at least in my earlier study, I have overstated the differences. There are differences, as I was trying to explain, but I don't think we should overstate them. In music, there is also improvisation, and performances of the same piece of music can vary very differently a lot under the hands of different maestros. Musical harmony doesn't necessarily have to have a very hierarchical structure, especially since the 19th century when non-tonal music came to the fore. There seems to be a lot more variation to this understanding of harmony. And on the other side of the equation, cooking can also accommodate structure. Some would require structure. Even though new ingredients may, of course, bring very delightful flavors, but if you read traditional cookbooks, they always mention two key ingredients, salt and plum, well, salt and vinegar. So much so that the phrase 盐梅 has been applied to other contexts, describing, for example, a very able prime minister in the service of the empire, without whom there would not be precisely harmony. Differences do remain, and here I cite other examples from the Lao Tzu and invite you to consider how to interpret these passages. A famous passage, chapter in the Lao Tzu, describes the generation of the so-called 10,000 things, all beings, as a harmonious whole from the interaction between the yin and yang qi. 冲气以为和. Now, some commentators chose to interpret this word, this character, 冲, not in a verbal sense, but connected with the sense of emptiness, but I won't go into that story. But if you more intuitively think of 冲 as a verb, it seems very different. It's very difficult to understand this passage from the perspective of musical harmony. What kind of he will come out in the end? But if you understand he from the perspective of cooking, it would make a lot more sense, wouldn't it? Another chapter, quite famous also, he qi guang tong qi chen. Now, this he is very often translated as somehow softening, dimming the very bright glare. And this I take from our distinguished translator, D.C. Lau. Was D.C. New Asia?
No, Chongqing.
Oh, Chongqing. Okay, we forgive him. And many other, and many, of course, I've benefited a lot from D.C. Lau's studies of Chinese philosophy. Now, if you translate he qi guang in the sense of softening the glare of brightness, you will be understanding he from the perspective of musical harmony. Again, think of an orchestral performance. Anything that is too loud, anything that is out of place would disrupt the balance and harmony of the whole. So if something is too bright, tone it down so as to maintain the overall balance. But if you think about he from the perspective of cooking, in the sense of blending different ingredients together, he qi guang may suggest not so much dimming what is bright as harmonizing diversity. Going over the 100+ English translations of the Lao Tzu, you find about 3 or 4, okay, maybe 4 or 5, who would translate he in this context in the sense of mixing, in the sense of merging, and in the sense of harmonizing. So it is possible. It is possible. Similarly, another chapter, chapter 55, where the Lao Tzu likens the sage who embodies fully the Tao to a newborn infant. Now, it would seem to me a lot more intuitive to imagine the fullness of virtue as a unified, harmonious whole. So he, in that context, will have to be understood not from the perspective of music making, but from the perspective of fine cooking. So the point I'm trying to get at is that in the early literature, you will already find a different understanding, different interpretations of this central concept. I have chosen this particular Lao Tzu passage also because it addresses the distinction between harmony, he, on the one hand, and sameness, tong, on the other. Again, to drive home the point that interpretation is always contested. Now, of course, you all know that the Lenyu distinguishes harmony from sameness, and it has come to be accepted almost as canonical, the definitive stance of Confucian ethics, he而不同. The Zhuozhuan also makes the same distinction, but there were other interpretations. There were other views. I cite the example of a text found in Ma Wangdui, as well as in the Guodian bamboo texts. Were they returned to China from CUHK? Did we play a role in this transaction as well? Some of the recently excavated manuscripts, bamboo strips, would not have become known had it not been for the help of CUHK. So there, in a text called the Wu Xing, later called, by later editors as the Wu Xing, and that text is generally associated with none other than Confucius' grandson, Zisi, and Mengzi. So clearly of Confucian origin. And here you find a different understanding of the relationship between harmony and sameness. According to the Wu Xing, with harmony, there is then sameness. And with such sameness, there is shan, there is goodness. The Ma Wangdui version of this text actually comes with an explanation. Sort of like the Mozi, you have the Jing, you have the text, main text, and then you have the Shuo, you have the explanation. And what does it say? Harmony, it says, it's like the harmony of the 5 musical tones. More importantly, sameness, Hong, is the full extent of goodness. Now that is very different from He, Bu Tong, isn't it? So, which is the correct, as it were, understanding of harmony? Here, of course, we are not trying to decide which is the so-called correct interpretation, but to think about the dynamic nature of interpretation, of understanding of key ethical concepts. And I think these examples should at least alert us to the fact that the early Chinese intellectual scene was a lot more dynamic and unsettled, and in that sense contested, as some later scholars would like us to believe. Sorry, it's very wordy. So having sort of laid out the 2 main interpretations of harmony, now I want to see whether there is space in between. I want to explore further the relationship between the 2 because I think both are equally important to the contemporary reflection on Confucian ethics, where harmony would remain central. In musical harmony, you require a tune, an overall score, a grand narrative if you want to change the metaphor. Diao is the tune. Now, in fine cooking, the same character now becomes tiao. In fact, the first time I sort of started looking into this concept was when I realized I mispronounced the phrase diu cha in Cantonese. I always said tiu cha. And then one day, somebody told me, no, it's not tiu cha, it's diu cha. How many of you would say tiu cha? Oh. Apparently, it should be diu cha. Huh? Same character, diao would convey, would denote actually a tune, but in another sense, L would yield another semantic universe, blending, mixing, merging different elements together. Keep stirring if you like to make soup, if you like to cook. This constant stirring is critical to ensure that the different elements would come together, and not just come together, but come together well. So to me, it seems that the musical sense of harmony emphasizes more harmony as a desired end, a goal. Whereas if you think of tiao, blending, the sense of harmony seems to focus more on the process. Again, I don't want to overstate the distinction. I made the mistake already. So this time I want to be a little bit more careful. They certainly do not suggest that they stand totally in opposition to each other. Relative emphasis, as I say here, certainly does not entail total neglect, even though it makes a difference to interpretation. And what I really wanted to is to explore the space in between, how the two can come together in order to help us to understand harmony or harmonization in today's context. In Chinese philosophy, the desired goal of the ethical life is rooted in an imagined pristine human condition. That's the original condition. If there are philosophy students among us, think about John Rawls, okay? That's the pristine original condition. Again, coming back to the metaphor of a crane calling out and its offsprings responding in kind to it, the basic understanding there is that the world is bound by networks of relationships with kinship ties forming the bedrock of that system. But the larger point remains that human experience is relational and interactive. I think that point, I need not belabor it. It's fairly common understanding of Chinese perception of the world. Now, at the most basic biological and psychological level, early Chinese philosophers considered the heart or the mind, Xing, is constantly being moved by and responding to external stimuli. The crane calling out, the offspring, the baby bird, the baby crane responding to it. You have to gan first before you can yin. And this process really requires a medium. It requires a mechanism. And in early China, the shared understanding was that human beings are constituted by qi. That's the conduit where the gan can be felt, leading to a response. The physical organs of the body are formed by qi. So even the xing as an organ is formed by qi. Xue qi is definitely gives you a sense of how the human constitution is being understood. And the operations of the other organs, to say here, I just try to summarize it very generally. All cognitive, affective, motor, brain functions, everything was understood as operations of qi. Sometimes the concept of qi may not have been emphasized or put in the foreground, but it is always in the background. Think of your own examples again. 好声好气. Think, what is the relationship between the 好声 and the 好气? If qi is not responsible for the production of sound, that phrase would not make very much sense. I happen to have read an article that is very interesting talking about the universal human expression of anger. Some psychologists, neuroscientists, they study the expression of anger in one's face. And in China, in Chinese, what is angry? The word for angry? 生气, isn't it? And that's the production of qi. And in fact, that phrase appears in the Zhuangzi, as if you can well imagine the gan and the yin. You can feel the qi coming up, 生气, rising to the fore. Cantonese is even more what's the word I'm looking for? It's more graphic. 激氣. What does it mean? What does 激氣? And you can picture it, it's like water splashing against a rock. Almost, well, it's not a full explosion, but you get the picture. So this is pervasive. This is everywhere, even though the concept of qi might not have been the topic of discussion in some Confucian texts. Now, in this background then, there is a sense that this notion of qi is not only responsible for all our cognitive and affective functions, but it also carries an ethical sense. That there are innate moral sentiments driven equally by this concept of qi. Again, I turn to the Wu Xing, the Ma Wangdui version of it, which refers explicitly to key ethical Confucian ethical concepts in terms of qi. 人气, well, 义气 is still common today, even though 人气 may be a bit odd in modern Chinese. 理气. Now, how would that work? But the basic assumption again is that the qi is what enables ethical behavior and expressions. And of course, it also explains the basic human response that we would reciprocate in harmony to the call of one's kin, a friend, or in other contexts. It also becomes the basis of filial piety, also the basis of humaneness. And in fact, in another Ma Wangdui text, there is reference to this notion of qi of the sage, sheng qi. It's not a common expression today, but the fact that even sagehood, sageness, is understood from the perspective of qi is worth noting. Now, this imagined pristine condition is described as a state of harmony. Of course, they realize that there are other instincts and other sentiments besides 仁, 义, and other ethical sentiments. I mean, in a case of danger, for example, if you feel you're in danger, of course you felt it and your response would be very different. So early Confucian philosophers were certainly aware of it. I just mention Mencius here because the Mencius is particularly sensitive to the disturbances that may easily derail the Xing, the mind, from its ethical course. Xunzi is even more adamant that these other instincts must be carefully guarded against to ensure the flourishing of ethical excellence through education and through the practice of ritual propriety. These, I mean, that itself is a big topic, but I mention it here to suggest that in early Chinese thought, they're certainly not naive to think that human beings can flourish without any help, without any safeguard. Still, how to achieve harmony remains a question. Should it be like the performance of a musical piece? Or should it be like cooking? Some may even suggest you can find a shade of the difference between Confucianism and Taoism there. But again, I don't want to overstate the case. Enough to suggest that the concept of harmony should not be taken as a static concept, has always been understood in a single way. Rather, how we perceive harmony today is actually the result of a long process of distillation of different understanding and interpretations. And it is also our task to carry on that hermeneutical process. The Confucian assertion remains that certain moral sensibilities are inborn and play an important part in evolutionary natural selection. So if you look at the musical sense of harmony, then the claim is that all instinctive voices should follow the lead note of Ren, well, or Li too, and resulting in an ethical harmony like a flawless musical performance. I think this offers a very powerful ethical vision, but the actual management of social complexities would require further attention. If harmony conveys just a goal, no matter how much it is desired, it is also a process in which complex social relationships will have to be managed or even transformed. Recent research in complexity science, I think, may offer some insight to the understanding of Confucian philosophy. Confucian ethics today should recognize, I think it does recognize, that social relationships are dynamic and constitute a non-linear, complex adaptive system. And here I'm deliberately using the language of complexity science. Relationships such as that between father and son may appear linear, but agents are always complex. Actors are always complex, and they adapt through their interaction with others and the environment. In a complex system, behavioral input does not always lead to predictable outcomes. The initial condition may be favorable to harmony, but even small changes could bring very different results. When I read that, what immediately came to mind was Confucius' observation that the look on one's face, sir, is the most difficult to manage in filial conduct. I don't think he's trying to say you should act, appear, behave in a particular way. But there is insight. There is deep insight in recognizing that even very, very small changes could affect the equilibrium, the dynamic of the whole. Your dad tells you, go do your homework. A smile, a frown, sad look, actually would lead to different reactions. And that different reaction would in turn also generate other reactions. And that is the complexity of human relationships. And I think what Confucian ethics is trying to say is that in realizing that grand narrative, that grand vision, you will also need to constantly be on guard to make sure you keep stirring, to make sure you keep blending, to make sure that the ethical journey continues on its course. So again, the important point is not so much to command, to look or act in a particular way. If you take this notion of shun, of yielding, submitting to its literal conclusion, you might think the Confucian idea is simply for you to acquiesce. But here, I think the more insightful understanding would be the recognition that even small acts, small facial expression changes could change the dynamic and equilibrium of that relationship. May be more convenient to describe the Confucian sense of filial piety as creating a linear ripple effect from parents, family, all the way through to society at large. But I think that would be taking a linear understanding of human relationships. And that would neglect the complexities that actually constitute human interaction. So that to me is, I think, should be emphasized in contemporary reflections on Confucian philosophy, as opposed to a very simplistic idea that Confucian ethics wants us to do this, do that, what is good already defined, but rather recognizing that there could be so many complex difficulties and challenges that would require constant ethical intervention or mediation. Harmony then points to an active, harmonizing function that mitigates the sharp edges of human interaction. Now, in that sense, Ren and Li are not only the key ingredients, but also the active mediating influence, 调和, in an ethical broth or soup that requires constant stirring, like the mixing and blending that transforms the ingredients in a dish. How? It's just like ginseng. It just seeps into everything, the whole soup. Now just imagine if Ren and Li could infuse all the relationships. Now that is not just management, that is transformation. From raw relationships, even familial ties, into an ethical partnership. That I think is the important point about harmony that should be emphasized. So that the entire socio-political fabric would have this ethical flavor. In the government of the Zhou dynasty, there's actually an official mediator. It's a pretty high post called Tao Ren, and tasked with harmonizing 协和, the conflicts and discords of the people. So I think one could say that in the Confucian vision of things, every individual should be such an ethical mediator, a transformative ethical change agent who serves as the salt and vinegar, if you like, that breathes harmony into the entire community. So these two senses of harmony, both as a goal and as a process, to me present a more complete picture of Confucian ethics without a guiding vision, without an overall score. One may risk misrepresenting Confucianism as a form of a ruddinous pragmatism. Without a clear sense of the complexity of social relationships and the need for constant attention, one then may risk, on the other hand, misrepresenting Confucianism as a kind of irrelevant idealism. If we only take Confucian harmony in the musical sense, we may find it overly rigid and authoritarian. Even though with the caveats I have mentioned earlier, even in musical performances, Corina would know that very well. I mean, there can be a lot of freedom, but still, you have to adhere to an overall score. I mean, just imagine the percussions. I mean, it's too loud, it would just upset everything. Although rock and roll may have something different to say. Nevertheless, in traditional understanding of musical harmony, that is simply not possible. And if we only take Confucian harmony in a culinary sense, we may find it lacking in principle and direction. You just keep stirring, you add a bit here, a bit there. What are you trying to achieve? See? So now what I'm trying to suggest, if the two conceptions of harmony can be put to work together, that could actually help solve many of the difficulties and challenges we face in managing human relationships. The musical sense of harmony may have been privileged in traditional Confucian interpretation, and I think that had to do with the stratification of society, but the ethical life can hardly ignore the management of complexities in human relationships. And more recently, if you listen to President Xi Jinping's update, if you like, on 和谐 society, it now has to include the relationship between human beings and the environment. The emergence of cooperation, and now I return to complexity science, is a key feature of many complex adaptive systems. So in the Confucian context, it would require Ren and Li and other ethical ingredients to create a culture of cooperation. There is a field of study called social cognition associated especially with a scholar named Michael Tomasello. The sharing of ethical intention, which is very often done through mundane everyday acts, these would begin to change the nature of human encounters. Now, for those colleagues in philosophy, I certainly do not mean to suggest that cooperation can be understood as a kind of prisoner's dilemma where, you just try to optimize benefits. You just try to strategize in order to optimize your own returns. And in fact, here, that's another important topic that I would like to come back to on another occasion. Even interpretation of filial piety in early China also contested. In the Mozi, for example, there's very clear understanding of xiao as what brings benefits to parents. Li qing. But if you read the mentions, li, benefit, is never emphasized. What is important is what is right, yi. That too is, I think, worthy of attention. But in any case, rather than seeing harmony as a condition imposed on the people by the sage, or a select group of junzi, if you like, it may be more fruitful to situate it in the context of human interaction, how human beings guided by their moral sentiments work through, like a good chef, the complexities of social relationships in creating a measure of order and equilibrium. Let me conclude. The health of a society certainly cannot depend on just one agent, as I mentioned, but would require collective effort, the collective effort of all members in achieving harmony in a sense of constant negotiation, ethical negotiation, would also perhaps point to a way out of the so-called tragedy of the commons, where everybody consume limited resources, thinking only about their benefit, creating conflicts as a result. This harmonizing function this notion of infusing an ethical flavor into every human endeavor and relationship, I think, would be a useful suggestion. These remarks certainly have left out many other factors that would impact the management of diversity. Law is clearly, something I have not mentioned. And increasingly, I've been thinking also about defense, especially military intervention. At what point would that become necessary in the maintenance of complexities? But that's another story. In this discussion, I also hope to suggest that Confucian reflections today could benefit from other fields of studies, such as complexity science or evolutionary biology. And by the same token, science can also learn from Confucian philosophy in recognizing the power of ethical mediation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and may Professor Chen please stay at his seat. May we also invite Professor Lau to participate in the Q&A session.
Okay. Thank you.
Maybe I have.
I have prepared for my question for our conversations in this room and also the others for the Zoom's purpose. So thank you so much for Professor Chen's so inspiring talk on the multivalent meanings of in Chinese and Confucian philosophy and culture. And of course, the concept is very complex and very different meanings according to different texts. And for example, Professor Chen's quote, internet learning, 有赚, mental monkey, more, loudly. So all these different classical scriptures and different interpretations of the concept of color, and also the chance start from musical harmony and also the art of cooking. So I think this is our daily experience to get a sense of the different levels and meanings of harmonies in our daily lives. And I think Professor Chen gave us a very good message, telling us that as this a method of important concept in Chinese culture, and we need to be careful about this different level of interpretation. So I think this is a very important reminder for us to interpret and also studies any specific concept in Chinese culture. But this is the first part in Professor Chen's lecture. The second part is very important as the topics mentioned that complexities, which is very important in our daily life and experience in today's world. So I think the reflection of the concept within the complex human situation and context is one of the major contribution, and also the message Professor Chen delivered. Especially he gave us the related concept qi, because in our human context, the psychological, biological, and all these qi manifestations in our daily life. But He and she can lead to planning and also contribute to benefit. So I think change message is very important for us to think more about the classical concepts within our complexities of human condition. So I just want to summarize and give some ways of what I understand from Chan's talks 4 minutes ago. And in the following, I would like to invite all of your comments, questions, suggestions, so that we can conduct further dialogues on the complexities of the concept. Okay. And okay, listen, please.
Thank you so much, Chen, for this enlightening and fascinating lecture full of wisdom. So my question is, well, from the perspective of complex electric systems, you can think about it as an emerging property that goes beyond sort of individual and sort of manifests at a system level. I think that applies both to the cooking and the musical metaphors. So my question is, well, so let's imagine, my question is about the path towards suppose if we start from the not so ideal conditions, right? So that's the not so harmonious condition, and we aspire to move towards the conditions of harmony. And then I think there would be some tensions across different strands of ancient Chinese thoughts on how to achieve that, right? I think one dimension is, so whether we rely primarily on our inner cultivation or sort of rely more on external institutions, building and coordination. I think that's one dimension. The second dimension is, well, the idea of your way, this action and non-action. Right? So I think perhaps the common perception is your way is more like Confucianism, and the way is more Taoism. That's my very sort of simple understanding of this. But I'm wondering what's your view on this, right? So this is about the path towards harmony. So that's my first question. The second question is, I think in today's lecture, we've covered classic texts from Confucianism and Taoism. So I'm wondering, how does the legalism thoughts fit into this? So the school of legalism, let's say Hanfei, right, or Sangyang, right? So because when we try to make understand the ancient China's government system, there's a long saying that it's sort of a yang ru yin fa, right? So sort of on the surface is more Confucianism, but the inner core, the institutional design is more like legalism. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this. So and the third question, this is kind of if we create this conversation between the ancient Chinese thought on harmony and the more modern Western ideas of social order, again from the perspective of a complex adaptive system, I think it's very interesting. Your comments directly sort of inspire me to think about Adam Smith, right? So invisible hand, the idea of invisible hand. And I think that's an emergent property as well. So would that be kind of some kind of her as well from the Confucianism point of view? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chen. There is no question that the end result we want is at least to manage complex systems, if not to transform it, right? So how to achieve it? I will give you one answer, which will be the topic of my second lecture, and that is 博文乐理. So that would be the Confucian approach to achieving the kind of grand narrative it has envisioned. But I also take the point that there are other views as to how it may be achieved. If you move from one extreme, let's say, again, think about cooking. There are many, many remarkable chefs who would say, less is more. Just don't keep. Lao Tzu has a chapter to the effect that if you want to cook a small fish well, what do? You certainly don't want to stir it, flip it too often, otherwise it will become scrambled fish, right? If you want to cook it well, let's not mess it up, if you like. Then to the other extreme, you need constant supervision, very strict control, and that would be closer to the Fajia idea. And to me, the Confucian version tries to strike a balance between these two. So again, the objective is very clear. The different pathways also were hotly debated in early Chinese philosophy. So that's how I would approach this general topic.
About the Western context, how interpret or cultivate the values of color according to
No.
Western context?
There is actually a postscript to this talk. There's another way of looking at this question. Is there a middle path, a middle way between melting pot on the one hand and multiculturalism on the other? I mean, you're talking about managing complexities, and it's certainly very complex when one's culture opens to other cultures, learning from them sometimes, but certainly adding more tension, even more complexity into the equation. So the classical American model of a melting pot, just like cooking. So in the end, one taste. You cannot distinguish the different constituents. The multiculturalism model, on the other hand, it's just like a symphony. You can still tell the distinctive constituents, their different cultures are still distinct, but somehow they manage to create a harmonious society. And what I'm trying to suggest is that you would probably need both in order to manage, or better still, transform human relationships from simply a sociological phenomenon to an ethical phenomenon.
Okay. Another question? Thomas, you are not sure about that.
Well, Chen, thanks for bringing in complexity theory. Also, very much in the minds of linguistic research. Okay. I guess my question is basically following up on the earlier question. From the point from the perspective mentioned that some of the ethical notions are inborn. But then you're presenting the concept of harmony, clearly something emergent. Okay, it's due to complex adaptive systems. So I guess my question is how you, whether you could shed light on what kinds of ethical notions are, in your view, inborn and what kinds of related notions are emergent due to interactions between agents in complex adaptive systems. So that's something that really interesting.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Again, I don't think these are mutually exclusive. Take xiao, filial piety, as an example. One could argue that xiao is an inborn sentiment, inborn ethical sentiment even, but it's raw. The crane calling out, the offspring responding to it, it's just affection. Nurture, on the other hand, is like putting a little bit of salt into that relationship. It flavors it with deeper ethical meaning, so that E, for example, rightness, would become a part of xiao. So you can no longer interpret filial piety simply as raw relationship, raw sentiment. But in this soup, in this ethical soup, one concept, one ethical ingredient would impact on the realization of the others. So how I would approach the question you have raised. The challenge, of course, is always, as I said earlier, when you are confronting different cultures, then the situation becomes even more complex. The question is, yeah, even in cooking, you can experiment with new flavors. You add turmeric. Turmeric is not, I think, native to Chinese cooking, I don't think. But if you add turmeric, it might work well. But is it anything goes? So that, to me, is the most challenging question. So maybe you do need, in the end, an overall score, a tune, that as your guiding vision.
Thank you very much.
I think you need a mic for the Zoom audience.
Thank you for a really informative and inspiring talk. Really sort of let me see how limited my knowledge is of classical Chinese texts. My question actually is simple. I wonder what is the conceptual opposite to is there a one word or phrase to describe the undesirable opposite of the harmonious state we want to achieve? Or is it possible that when it comes to he, that we're not talking about pairs such as yin and yang and yang and yin and so on and so forth? So that really is something that I think this lecture really makes me want to know. I think it should be very interesting to explore that. Thanks.
Well, what any politician fears the most would be 乱. So 不和 is only the start of disorder, disharmony, and you also find the 左传 contrasting between politics of harmony with politics of deviancy. So these are examples of the outcome of lack of harmony if we do not make the effort at least. But interestingly, in classical cooking, there is also a notion called 大羹不和. So this grand soup, it's still a soup for sacrificial offerings. It's not supposed to be fine, balanced, but just be raw. And so that is an issue that is worth exploring a little bit further. However, the opposite of harmony is quite clear. It would be disorder. It would be 乱. Josh, good.
Dr. Chen, I am struggling a little bit with the notion of temporality in the discussion of harmony, because in your discussion on cooking and musical harmony, there's a sense of beginning and end, and so you can achieve harmony, and we know what harmony tastes like and sound like. But in your discussion on this ethical transformation of complexities, can you talk more about whether the state of harmony is something that has, and what is the end game for harmony? And I think my struggle is on this original notion of the origin, the innate condition, the pristine condition as a state of harmony. It's not necessarily the case, because if that is the case, then then are we talking about trying to achieve chaos well, I think what I'm trying to make sense is whether the assumption is that we have to deal with chaos from the beginning in order to achieve harmony, or has harmony has always been the origin and we just try to maintain it.
Thank you, Josh. Yeah, that is very interesting. I would be inclined to say so. So if you start with a certain assumed or imagined pristine condition, you would either say, don't mess it up, then it will flourish on its own. That is closer to a Taoist understanding of how things ought to work. On the other hand, if you see this original condition as extremely fragile, and if you see this condition as being impacted by a lot of different new elements, including, let's say, foreign cultures, then you would be more mindful of how best to make sure that harmony persists. So these are the two possible positions. And coming back also to Max, your question, we can think of it at different levels. Again, start with the family. You assume that there is an original affection between parent and child. And that relationship can easily be soured, be turned into something else, including conflicts, which explains the Confucian insistence of the need for ethical mediation towards an ethical end and not simply kinship ties. So you're basically talking about transformation of kinship into an ethical relationship, the absence of which would then be, you're still kins, but it would be unethical without moral guidance, without that kind of moral flavor that would enrich the relationship. So I think that's how I would approach your question as well, George.
Please, I would like to know, how do you think of Confucian harmony to the economic development or social development for Hong Kong, for China?
Thank you very much. That is a tough one. No, I think what this is trying to suggest is that the world, in simple terms, or maybe simplistic terms, what the Confucian vision is trying to achieve is to ensure that all relationships, including economic, socio-political, are guided at least by ethical considerations. In a raw, pure economic development, one could conceivably end up in a situation where might becomes right. And is that what we want? I think that is the question we need to ask. An ethically flavored developmental soup, that's not necessarily be the most efficient or optimal. You could actually generate even more profit. And this is the question of li, of benefit, of profit. If you only focus on that, yes, you may actually yield even better returns. But at the same time, there is a cost. It could be social, it could be relational. So the idea is to ensure that all relationships are coated, infused with this kind of ethical flavor so that everybody can develop together. I think that's how the Confucian answer would be. One
more question.
No AI question, please. Gigi.
Innovation really makes it hard. So at some point in your talk, I think you mentioned, you used the term evolutionary natural selection. And I think at the end, you also make an intriguing suggestion that now when we study Confucian philosophy, especially with the back limit, when it's really connected to also certain scientific studies like evolutionary biology, you mentioned that. So I wonder if you can sort of elaborate on that a little bit, because one of my puzzles is, first of all, we usually think of natural selection in the biological context, right? We think of it as a blind, unguided process. But in your presentation, right, there's this intriguing picture of some kind of evolutionary process, but supposedly mediated, human guided. You just used moral guidance actually several times. So it's a very interesting picture there. So I wonder how exactly it's connected to what we usually think of natural selection in the standard biological context. Thank you.
Thank you. I mentioned AI because Professor Zhang is an expert in AI ethics. No, I was basically referring to a particular understanding of adaptive systems. And for these systems to flourish, the idea is that a culture of cooperation would emerge. So it's not simply, the strong would, overtake the weak. But if you try to understand how adaptive systems evolve, cooperation would become very, very important. So that's the assumption. Of course, it may not be right. So the Confucian idea can easily be understood as being complementary to that kind of understanding of complexities, of complex relationships. So that's the only point I was trying to get at. But come to think of it, if you assume that there are innate moral sentiments, it also stands to reason to try to strengthen and reach them so that they become pillars of development. So I think that might be overly idealistic, some may argue, but at the very least, I think it should be considered. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much, Chen, for the talk. It's really inspiring. But when the question comes to evolutionary biology, I just can't hold it anymore. So evolutionary biology, of course, there's a sense of time. So with time changes, there's the adaptation, of course, there is also the selection. But there is a practicality of what does the world need at the time. So relevant to what you're talking about and what I learned, and I also find it really threatening in a sense, is about whether harmony is the same or not the same. I think that when we talk about 和 and 不和, like 和 and 乱, I think for all of us, it is easily visible for us. There is a desirable quality of 和. Comes to 和 and the same. Then I started feeling that when it comes to a societal background with changes and so on, even when you were describing the origin of these two phrases from Confucian confusion and justice grandson. So this is a very short period of time in terms of, if I want to use evolutionary time, a couple of generations is a short change. But reasonably assuming that societal change appears, in a couple of generations, but the concept of whether harmony is the same or not the same, it could be like what you're describing. Is it about a soup type of, or is it like in a musical in an orchestra? So when we choose to be harmonious, is a very gentle concept, and everybody will probably have a choice. But when we choose to be harmonious, then being the same or not the same is really very, very different.
Yes.
You gave the example of cultural diversity.
Yes.
Merging to be the same or preserving the diversity is very, very different concept.
Mhm.
I thought that when we talk about soup, the essence is not just about the same. It's actually the essence of combining things that are different.
Yeah.
So it could be accommodating different things
Mhm.
is harmonious. Not necessarily that everybody becomes the same. So this is a little bit of sort of really trying to learn from you about harmonious is something that we could easily accept. When it's a contrast of the same and not the same, it's a very, very different.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much. That's very true. I suppose one way of thinking about this is to say that these were precisely the questions that the early Confucians were struggling with, and these questions continue to generate, to demand our attention today. Is there ever going to be a definitive answer? That's the desired goal. However, the process of this ongoing reflection is equally important. And the second point one may mention is that the notion of sameness could also be understood in different senses. The melting pot ideology, it doesn't matter where you're from. In the end, you're all Americans, just to use that example. But at the same time, one can also understand this notion of sameness as identity of purpose, as identity of ethical intention. Now, that, I think, would cast a slightly different light on this notion of sameness and how it is related to harmony. The only assertion is that for this kind of identity of purpose and ethical direction to flourish, you need harmony.
Okay, I think we have many good questions and also some fruitful conversation and dialogue with Professor Chen on this important concept and metaphors of the world in our Chinese culture and thought. And because I know you, Asia College, you have another evening banquet for
Yes.
anniversary celebration. So once again, thanks for Professor Chen's for remarkable and inspiring lectures, helping us to have a deeper understanding of the meaning of her in different levels of interpretation. Thanks so much. And now, finally, I think that we should give our congratulations to New Asia College for the 75th anniversary. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Chen, for this inspiring lecture, and thank you all again for coming.
Professor Chen will be delivering 2 more lectures on next Friday at Sherman Hall, CUHK, and next Saturday at the Hong Kong Central Library. So please feel free to come again. You can find the details of the lecture in the booklet. And lastly, please help us fill out the questionnaire by scanning the QR code at the back of the booklet or on the screen. Yeah. Thank you, and look forward to seeing you again at the next lecture.